What's up, guys? I pray you have a blessed day so far. Today, we're going to be talking about something very important, one of the most important special topics that we've ever spoken about, and it's about Jesus. Okay. More specifically, what exactly did Jesus do for you and me? What he did do for the whole world? What he did for everybody? Some of you, especially if you're Christian, and even if you're not Christian, at some point you may have heard some claim of what Jesus has done for us. If not, there's a new introduction for you altogether. But usually, most people go around the stuff of saying stuff like quoting one of the most famous verses in history, which is John 3:16, which basically states, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son." Or a phrase somewhere along the lines of, well, Jesus loved you so, so much. He loved you so, so much that he died on the cross for you. That he died for you because he loved you so much. Before you were ever born, he loved you to the point that he was willing to die so that you can be free and that you can have a relationship with him. And of course, this kind of conversations and statements of what Jesus did, there's nothing really anything wrong with it. It's perfectly fine. In fact, it's the gospel message. It's the truth. Jesus did die for us. He did this amazing sacrificial gift that we do not deserve. He went beyond the calling, but many of us don't know how far he actually went. See, what Jesus did for us was not just simply dying. He didn't just up and die for us. No, he went through so much more. What Christ did for you and me was not just death. He didn't just go on the cross and die like, ugh, that's it. No. And be warned, what he did is so painful and graphic. For some of us, we might not even be able to take it. So I'm going to warn you right now because we're going to go into detail what Jesus Christ did for you and me. And I'm going to tell you, I've thought about this, I've looked this up, and what Jesus did for us is beyond amazing. The price that he paid for you and me so that we can have life, so that we can have freedom, is beyond understanding. See, it's so painful that Jesus even knew how painful it would be. Jesus was in pain before the whole thing was happening. In fact, we see this mentioned multiple times through the Gospels. Right before he's arrested, he's in anguish. In fact, Luke 22:44 says it this way, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." I want you to grasp that. This passage is actually pointing out a state of being, an actual physical state that can happen. I know you think, nah, this is just an analogy. No, it's not an analogy. This can actually happen. This description is an uncommon disease or reaction your body really has to an extreme state of emotional stress. It usually only happens in extremely painful situations or anxious and fearful situations. In other words, what the scripture here in Luke chapter 22, verse 4 is pointing out is that Jesus, as he's knowing what he's going to do on the cross, as he's knowing this death that we constantly talk about, this is wonderful, it's truly wonderful. Jesus said he was so expectant of it. It caused him so much distress that he literally sweated out blood. I want you to keep that in your head. And as we keep talking about this, remember, I don't know where you are in your walk with Jesus. This is what he did for you. If you're a Christian, hey, this is for you to remember and refocus your life on him. So you understand, if you are a Christian that's kind of back and forth, this is the price Jesus paid for you. You need to get serious because right here, right at the beginning, this is the anguish he felt before he even died for you. And that's not mentioning the thousands of years he waited, patiently suffering through constant ridicule and going through all this kind of patient concepts that we probably would never be able to tolerate. If we were in Jesus' feet, we definitely would not tolerate the amount of nonsense that mankind has done to Jesus. We probably would not. Probably the second time we just would throw hands real quick. But ignoring all that, yes, at the time of Jesus, this is what he's going through. God in the flesh, having the flesh, the flesh in him, he was in so much anguish of what he knew he would had to go through. He was going through worse than a panic attack. This is a serious state of emotional state. In fact, Matthew 26:38 states that the very reason why he went to the garden to pray there was because he was in an overwhelming state. In fact, Matthew 26:38 in Mark chapter 14, verse 34 stated this way. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. So he's basically saying here, he's literally so overwhelmed that he wants to die. This is not bad today. My boyfriend broke up. No, this is a real state of situation. This is an extreme, hey, this guy needs medical attention. If you saw someone that was in this type of depression down the street, it would be so quickly obvious to you in this kind of sorrow that you would want them to seek help. You would notice the amount of stress and sorrow this person is feeling. It's not something that can be overlooked. And knowing that, we have to understand what Jesus went through was not easy. In fact, if we go through the details, just the historical information, that we can find multiple sources. Multiple historians will agree to this. What normally would occur in a crucifixion? You can break down the sequence of a crucifixion event. The crucifixion being how Jesus died, because he was crucified. But the crucifixion was not just simply a one set deal. It was not like a hanging or a gunshot execution or poison execution. No, this was a rigorous process and landed in a four sequence process. The first part is you were tortured. Before you were ever put on the cross, you were tortured, usually the night before. And you were tortured by various means, and we'll discuss in more details about what those means are. If you're interested in knowing what these things are, I encourage you to keep watching. If you really can't take this, by all means, go to another video, more cheerful video. But I want you guys to notice about what Jesus did for you. I really want you to grasp what Christ did for you, because he was tortured for you. He was literally tortured for you. Okay? And we're going to talk about what the painful process was in that torture. We're also going to be talking about how he had to carry his cross, literally carry what is called a crossbar or pentabolum to the place of crucifixion, to the place where he's going to be killed. So after the torture, you have to carry this piece of wood. And we'll talk about what that looks like and the difficulty about that a little bit more in detail later on in this video. But you have to carry that to the crucifixion. And the victim was also fastened by ropes or nails to the crossbeam. We're going to talk about specifically what that looks like and what Jesus went through specifically. But just in general, a crucified individual would either be nailed or tied down to their crucifixion post. And then they would raise the crossbeam of the victim to the wooden post or tree to a certain elevated height. And we'll talk about what that looks like more specifically. Now, remember, I want you to keep this in mind as we're going on, not just simply thinking about, okay, this is what Jesus did for me. Because that's important. Keep thinking about that. If you need to pause the video right now and start thinking about it. Okay? And also start meditating on this. Okay? Remember that the morality of the Roman Empire is not like the morality of today in the West. It is not. It is nowhere near. There's the same culture that, for the heck of it, just for the joy of it, they will grab prisoners, sometimes not even hard-ranked prisoners, sometimes it was just slaves that they got from war, and they put them in the Colosseum to be ate alive in front of an adoring audience while they cheered and laughed. I want you to catch it and think about it. They literally grab people, put them to be ate alive, and watch in enjoyment with laughter and joy. This is the kind of people we're talking about. They're pretty sick. They're kind of out there. Alright? In fact, they actually took pleasure in their torture and took multiple ways of disturbing the mental status of individuals. They just took pleasure in doing torture. We find that historical records constantly where the Romans were Oh, very, 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 let's say special in the way they integrated torture. They took such pleasure with it and so in so unique that it would make the tortures that we are appalled by today, such as waterboarding, that there was a huge controversy a while back, makes it look like child play. It really does. The amount of torture they did just made that looks like child's play. Which, in fact, some of the pre-crucifixion tortures would include that. For example, one of those tortures is flogging. One of the tortures you would get as a crucified individual, such as Jesus, is flogging. And flogging is basically like getting whipped, but in a much higher scale. Because not only are you getting whipped, which is painful and sometimes can take out skin, they put bone chips or glass. They tie stuff up to make it the whip a little tighter, uh, a little sharper, but not too sharp, so that when the whip hits you, it rips out your skin and it also rips out part of your flesh. Oftentimes, if you're whipped long enough by flogging, you could literally die. In fact, most precrucifixion tortures would lead you to flog to the point that just by your injuries, you would eventually die. You would eventually die just from the injury. Of course, they won't let you die at that point. They usually kept like a doctor near you so you can go with your crucifixion. Because they want to show your death and torture to everybody to basically make everybody pee their pants. Literally, they just want everybody to be scared. The other, now that's a pretty bad torture in itself, but the next version is the next form is they actually burn people. They literally just burn people, and oftentimes this burning would either be they would burn out your eye or burn parts of your body, burn your tongues. Sometimes they would get more imaginative in where they would burn you as well. They literally would do all kinds of different things with fire to just, I don't know, have fun with it. It's kind of disturbing. Another thing they would do is racking, which basically racking is they would grab a stick, a thick mallet stick, and smack you to the point that you actually had bags of blood, big little bumps of blood that would appear from your body just from the impact. The impacts that will constantly hit to you cause those kinds of injuries, bruises, broken bones, and even sacks of blood to pile up just because of the trauma of the actual injury. Um, you would also get mutilation. I'm not gonna get into too much detail on that, especially because there's no real evidence that that actually happened to Jesus, but sometimes it would cut off or injure the human private parts. They would also abuse the victims' families, which again, I do not believe Jesus went do that because we see evidence that Mary, was there afterwards. We see evidence that James and his brothers who were still after the crucifixion of Jesus still lived. So it's unlikely that they went through that kind of torture. However, we can't say the same about flogging and burning or racking. It is possible he could have been burned. We don't know for sure, but we do know that he was definitely flogged and he racked. Okay, now to give you an idea of how horrific this is, we even have an individual such as Plato, one of the most famous philosophers. Look him up. He states that a just man who is thought to be unjust will be scourged, racked, bound, will have his eyes burned out, and at last, after suffering every kind of evil, point this out, okay? Plato is living in a time period where he sees a lot of evil stuff as is known. In fact, another writing of Plato literally justifies racism, as in it's needed for society and it's good. And to us, we're like, no, that's evil. But he's saying to him, because to him that was moral. You got remember the morality here is a lot different. And if to him this is evil, it tells you something. Okay? Plato is telling you that he has to suffer, the victim has to suffer every kind of evil before he's impaled, before he is crucified. So all this torture of evil, painful suffering, Jesus went through all that for you before he was even crucified. We're talking about the death, but no, 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 wait, pause. He didn't just die. He went through every kind of evil, every kind of suffering, long before he was crucified. So before he was crucified for your life, because he loved you, he suffered every kind of evil, every kind of pain possible, to the point that an immoral kind of guy, whose morality is already questionable in of itself, says something about it, saying every kind of evil. And what Plato is saying here is not talking about Jesus, but it fits Jesus very well because Jesus was a just man. In fact, even Pontius Pilate himself says this is an innocent man. There's no reason why we should punish him. But he still went through the process. Now, beyond just simply some of these, we do know Jesus was flogged. We see that Pilate mentioned himself. He ordered it, and we see John 19, chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate ordered him to be flogged. We also see in Mark chapter 15, verse 16, one more kind of actual torture that Jesus went through, and it goes into quite a bit of detail. In Matthew 27-28, we get a little bit more detail, but let's read 16 to 20 real quick in Mark chapter 15. The soldiers led Jesus away into the courtyard of the palace, known as the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole company of soldiers. I'm going to pause right there so you understand this. Every soldier that was in that area was called to do this. They were entertaining themselves. They grabbed the whole group to decide how to torture this man. So they decided to dress him up in purple robe, purple normally being the color of royalty, and twisted together a crown of thorns and forced it on his head, putting it on him. They saluted him and said, "Hey, King of the Jews." Again and again, in a mocking manner, they they struck his head with a stick. They spat on him and knelt before him to honor him. When they finished mocking him, they stripped him of his purple robe and put his own clothes back on him. Then they led him to be crucified. Matthew 27, verse 28 to 20 to 30 gives more detail and says in more detail that when they grabbed them, they grabbed the staff that they had given him because they gave him a staff. And with that same staff they gave him, they struck his head again and again and again. It was not a one-time thing. They struck that head enough that the man would be unrecognizable. That they would build these bags of blood. Are you getting this? If you need a second to kind of mold this over and put it in your head, pause the video and remember and thank God, because this is what Jesus literally did. Man, God, taking the flesh of man, came down and suffered this for you long before he was crucified. Okay, and keep in mind that Jesus was raised as a carpenter. Joseph was a carpenter and taught Jesus to be a carpenter. Carpenters back then didn't have power tools, so they were beefed up men. Okay, think of the toughest looking dude in the gym, probably around that area, maybe a little short is what Jesus kind of looked. He was buffed. He was not a skinny dude or half fit. No, he was fit. He had to for the kind of job he had to do as a carpenter. And after undergoing that torture, the next thing he had to do was carry his crossbeam. His crossbeam was this heavy wooden plank that he had to carry, which would be what he would eventually be, his arms would eventually be nailed or tied to, and then that would be tied to either a tree post or a larger plank, which he would be crucified on. Okay, so he had to carry that. Um, and he had to carry that to his crucifixion site. Okay, we see an example of this in John chapter 19, verse 17, and Mark chapter 15, verse 21-22. In fact, when you compare them, you take notice of a little thing. In John chapter 19, verse 17, it says that Jesus carried the crossbeam himself. Meanwhile, Mark 15, 21-22 says that someone was ordered to help him carry it. to carry the cross for Jesus. In other words, what was going on was Jesus was trying to carry it by himself, but he did not have the strength. After the torture, Jesus collapsed. He was so severely tortured. He was so beat in the head. He was so severely flogged. And we don't know for sure if he was burned or not, but if he was burned, he also had that, to the point that it was difficult, this strong carpenter, to carry the crossbeam to his execution. So he had to ask someone else to help him carry his crossbeam. Now, of course, this was not enough, because walking up to the cross, where you're going to be crucified and where you're going to be fixed, is actually a piece of torture as well. See, Pseudo Manetho in the 3rd century AD describes how the crucifixion must have looked to the people who are going to get fixed on the cross. Because once you arrive at the execution place, your executioner would fix you on the cross by either tying you up or putting nails on your hands or legs. In Jesus' case, historically, we believed he was nailed on the cross by his hands. In fact, we even get scriptural verses. Mark chapter 15, verse 24 says he was in fact nailed. So he was not tied, which would probably made it easier for Jesus. No, he was nailed. And the nails, these are not modern nails, not easily well crafted nails. No, these are likely jaggedy nails, long, thick ones, not very sharp, because they were made by a blacksmith. And usually they were not made to be sharp. They were not made to be cut. They were made to be forced into. So they usually just had a similar shape and could sometimes be very jaggedy. And rarely ever very sharp, so force was used severely to get that nail into you. It was not a comfortable way to do that. It's uncomfortable to have a sharp nail. Think about a unsharpened, jaggedy nail. Pretty painful. But once you go through that, punish on their tortured bodies. This is how Pseudo Manetho describes it. Punish on their tortured bodies. They see the stake, the cross, as their fate. In the bitterest of torment, they have been fastened with nails to become evil banquets for birds and terrible scraps for dogs. So once you go through the torture, once you've gone through everything, now you're staring at death. And not an easy death, because you know that to die there is a slow, agonizing death. By this point, you already fed up. You just don't want to get over with. You just want to die. At this point, you've gone through it. You've gone through the whole thing. But he said, no, at this point, you're just staring at the next part. It's gonna be agonizing yourself through the process, only to become scraps of food. Seneca describes a similar image when he says, can anyone be found who prefer wasting away in pain, dying limb by limb, or letting out his life drop by drop, rather than expiring once and for all? Can any man be found willing to be fastened to the cursed tree, long sickly, already deformed, swelling in ugly tumors on the chest and shoulders, and draws breath amid a long, drawn out agony? It's clear from what here he's saying, Seneca, it is a long, painful process to be crucified, to die on the cross. This is just the cross section we're talking about, not the torture. The torture is already another long piece. If you need, again, if you need a pause and think about this and meditate on this and chew on it, feel free to pause if you didn't come back. Okay, if you need to go because you can't handle this, okay. Just know Jesus loves you. And all this he's doing is because he loves you so much he was willing to suffer through it all. Okay. Now the ugly tumors that he's mentioning here is those little balls of blood that we were talking about. It was probably resulted from being hit in the crucifixion, just like Jesus was hit in the head repeatedly by a stick. Okay. Now, victims while they're being raised, you would think, okay, you just nail them up. No, they weren't just about nailing them out because they didn't just want to torture physically, they want to torture emotionally, just as we saw in the passage where they were mocking Jesus the entire time they were torturing him. They want to break you mentally, physically, and emotionally. So to do that, they also execute you without clothes. Probably to make you more susceptible, not just to blows where people are throwing things at you, because that was also a possibility. And it was also to increase your shame. Melito, a second century bishop who likely saw crucifixions before, wrote in his sermon on the Passion of Christ, "The sovereign has been made unrecognizable by his naked body and has not even allowed a garment to keep him from view." Because people of his day had indicated this, they likely had known how this looks. Okay? Now, the executioners usually raise the one being executed by the crucifixion a bit from the ground. It's not like we see in the movies where they're quite a bit up the ground, about 6 feet up the ground. No, it was likely just enough so that you could not stand on your 2 feet, so you cannot tiptoe on your 2 feet. Just enough height that it was torturous for you to breathe. In other words, the whole point was to lift you up, that if you raise your hands, you would not be able to breathe. You'll be pulled down by gravity. So you're feeling the pain of gravity pulling you down as if your socket's being removed because you're still nailed. You're feeling like your flesh is being ripped apart, and you have to pull yourself up simply to breathe because you also feel like you're being choked out or you're drowning because you cannot breathe in that position. We see this mentioned in several texts. And this is likely the way how Jesus suffered the crucifixion. You're going through this for several hours. Likely many hours and a slow and painful death. We see this kind of death and treatment pointed out in Jesus' crucifixion, specifically in Mark chapter 15, verse 22 to 32, which states, "They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means skull place. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. They crucified him. They divided up his clothes, drawing lots from them to determine who would take that what. In other words, they took his clothes from him and then sold it between each other. They just took it and made it theirs. It was their property now. It would not be an inheritance to his family. Okay? It was 9 in the morning where they crucified him. The notice of the formal charge against him was written, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 outlaws with him. Some translations may say robbers, and it's important to remember that because we're going to be talking about what these kind of outlaws really were, what these robbers in scriptures really are, because they're not just simply thieves. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second, and it will tell you what kind of people are actually crucified. They crucified 2 outlaws with him, one on his right and one on his left. People walking by insulted him, shaking their heads, saying, "Ha! So you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Save yourself. Come down from that cross." In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him amongst themselves, together with legal experts. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then we'll see and believe." So boastful and so sassy, throwing all kinds of salt as possible. And if that was not enough, everybody walking by were making fun of him as he's going through this process. Imagine you going through the worst kind of pain in your life, and everybody back you just making fun of you the entire time. Does not feel good. It breaks you inside. Most of us, if we went through that, we would say, "What kind of horrible people?" If we saw that in a YouTube video today or a TikTok short, we'd say, "Man, these people are messed up. They're just making fun of this dude. He literally is dying, and he's just taking videos and laughing. And laughing. What's wrong with them? Why won't they help?" Right? That's what's going on here. Okay? I want you to keep in mind that we wouldn't handle that. We would throw hands with these kind of people. That's why Jesus said, "No, wait, wait, wait. Forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Even in that process, even at this point, Jesus so loved us, he said, "No, forgive them, for they do not know They do. Even those who have been crucified with Jesus also insulted him, specifically one. We see in other Gospels saying one specific said so, and the other one actually said no, doing true fear of the Lord. Now, those descriptions usually give the description of these two being robbers. Now, ancient texts of all crucifixion show that these crucifixions were terror tactics mostly used not to punish every villain. It's actually mostly to target rebels or rebellious natives of lands that they've conquered. In other words, people that would consider second-class citizens. And these rebellious natives would be called robbers. In other words, Jesus was crucified as the worst kind of creature and a second-class citizen. That's the punishment they gave him. Some sources refer to crucifixion as such rebels being seen in Spain, Ephesus, and Judea. The Digest of Roman Law encourages executioners to crucify famous robbers at the scene of their crime, which is likely that where Jesus was crucified along with these two robbers was where Barabbas would have been crucified. The same man that the Jews asked to give the Pontius Pilate to give it to them and give him his freedom instead of Jesus. Basically, Jesus died in the place of Barabbas, a rebel, a horrible human being. And that gives us an image. Okay, guys? It gives you the image of who we are in this picture. We are Barabbas. We are the guilty sinners, the guilty evildoers, the rebels against the created order that mess all kinds of things up. We did all horrible things. He took our place and died where we should have died so that we may live and have an eternal relationship with him. That's what he did for you. So now that you got that in your heart, if you need and you don't have not been saved, all you need to do is ask God forgiveness and start a relationship. Do that prayer with it yourself. Bring it from the heart and start talking to Jesus. But if you have that relationship already, I want you to take this with you. Don't just leave. Remember what Christ did for you. And live like that, knowing what he's done. Don't simply live, okay, yeah, he did for that, and walk next day and walk away. No, live it out. Because this is the price that he paid for you. Are you going to waste it? Or are you going to make it worth it? Well, guys, I pray that this blessed you in some sort of way. I pray it's helped you see what Jesus really did and how much he really cares about you. Because he really does. No matter where you are in your walk. Doesn't matter where you are in relationship with Jesus, whether you're just meeting Jesus for the first time today, you're giving your life to Jesus in the middle of this video, or right after this video, or if you have been Christian for years and have lived a life, or if you're a ministry, guys, let's all together remember what Jesus did for us. And let's not take advantage of it. Okay? Well, have a wonderful and blessed day. If you like this kind of content, if you want to see this kind of things again, please hit that like and subscribe button and have a wonderful and blessed one.